Hey there, welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going to tackle a case that really, it sent shockwave through New York City and ignited a nationwide debate. We're talking about the death of Jordan Nealy and the trial of Daniel Penny.
Yeah.
And this isn't just a legal case, right? It's a story that really forces us to confront some pretty uncomfortable realities about mental health and race and self-defense and really the very fabric of our society.
Yeah, it's a case with no easy answers, that's for sure.
Oh, absolutely.
And it throws a spotlight, I think, on the complexities of our social systems and, the challenges we face when we try to address these really difficult problems.
Yeah. Okay, so to really understand this case, we need to go back to the beginning. So picture this May 1st, 2023, a crowded subway car in New York City. And Jordan Nealy, a man struggling with homelessness and documented mental health issues, is on that train. Mm-hmm. And our sources mentioned that he was actually known for his Michael Jackson impersonations. And there was footage of him performing, which is, you see those videos and knowing how his story ends, it just adds this whole other layer of tragedy.
Yeah, it's a reminder that behind every headline, behind every legal battle, there's a human life with the story.
Right.
And it's easy to get lost in the abstract arguments. But we need to remember that Jordan Nealy was a real person with struggles that ultimately led to this fatal encounter.
Right. And on that same subway car was Daniel Penny, a former Marine. Mm-hmm. And their paths crossed in a way that would forever alter both their lives and spark this huge firestorm of controversy.
Yeah.
And witness accounts from the sources that we've been looking at paint a picture of Nealy behaving erratically.
Yeah.
Shouting on the train.
You're right. And that's really where the debate lies, I think.
Right.
Because was his behavior a genuine threat, or was it more a manifestation of his mental health struggles, amplified by that enclosed environment of a subway car?
It's a critical question because it shapes how we interpret everything else.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
Like was Penny, his supporters argue that he acted in self-defense.
Right.
Right? He perceived a threat to himself and others. But his critics say, no, there was no physical assault, and this was an overreaction.
Yeah, and I think understanding, mental health nuances is so important here.
Right.
Because the sources do indicate that he had a history of schizophrenia and PTSD.
Right.
And, these conditions, often exacerbated by homelessness, can really lead to unpredictable behavior that might be perceived as threatening, even when there's no intent to harm.
Right, and that's what makes this case so complicated.
Oh.
It's not just the actions.
Yeah.
It's the context.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
What led to this. Mm-hmm. And it's also striking that, you've got a crowded subway car and nobody else intervened.
Right. Yeah. And that raises, that question of bystander apathy. Mm-hmm. When it comes to people perceived as different or struggling with mental health issues,
Yeah.
Did people freeze up? Were they unsure how to react? Or was there some deeper societal disconnect happening?
Yeah. So let's walk through what happened next.
Yeah.
So Penny, in response to Nealy's behavior, placed him in a chokehold. Mm-hmm. And he maintained that hold for several minutes, which ultimately led to Nealy losing consciousness and, tragically, his death.
Right.
And this, of course, what ignited the protests across New York. Mm-hmm. And beyond it, the incident wasn't viewed in isolation, but as a symptom of larger systemic issues. There was outrage over what many saw as excessive force, racial bias, and a failure to address mental health challenges.
Yeah.
And, reading through these sources, it's impossible to ignore the raw emotion, the pain and frustration that poured out in those protests. It wasn't just about this incident. It was about a system that failed Jordan Nealy and countless others.
Absolutely. And that pain wasn't just on one side of this debate either. The sources also highlight a lot of strong emotions from the people defending Daniel Penny. They saw him as someone who was just trying to, protect himself and others in a volatile situation. Mm-hmm. And they felt that, charging him with manslaughter was a real overreach.
And this brings us to the legal fallout.
Right.
So the Manhattan District Attorney's Office made the decision to charge Penny with manslaughter.
Right.
And that immediately became controversial. Mm-hmm. Some people said it was too lenient, didn't reflect how serious Nealy's death was. Others felt it was totally unjust that he was being punished for trying to protect others.
Right. And it's interesting to unpack that manslaughter charge specifically.
Right.
Because it hinges on proving recklessness or criminal negligence.
Okay.
And the sources mentioned that legal experts were really divided on whether Penny's actions met that threshold.
Yeah.
Some argued that the chokehold maintained for that length of time was reckless.
Right.
While others said, well, in a high stress situation, it's really hard to judge the appropriate level of force.
Yeah, absolutely. And the trial itself I mean, it must have been so tense
It was.
with the weight of all these issues.
Yeah, intense media coverage. The courtroom was packed.
Wow.
Both sides presented their arguments very forcefully. The prosecution saying, Penny overreacted, used excessive force. The defense arguing he acted instinctively to protect himself and others.
Right. And then our sources detail how the jury ultimately acquitted Daniel Penny of all charges.
Right.
And that verdict just reverberated across the country.
Yeah.
It further fueled these divisions in public opinion that were already there. Some saw it as justice served. Others felt it sent this chilling message about, the value of a life like Jordan Nealy's.
And what's fascinating is that even with a legal resolution, the case didn't really settle any of the larger societal questions. It became a symbol, a focal point for discussions about mental health, race, and our responsibility for those in need.
Okay, so let's zoom out a little bit
Yeah.
to the bigger picture. What did this case expose about those systems that you talked about?
Well, one of the most glaring issues is the state of mental health care. Particularly for people experiencing homelessness.
Yeah.
The fact that Jordan Nealy was living on the streets while struggling with serious mental illness, really speaks volumes about the gaps in our safety net.
Right.
He was in and out of hospitals, but there just wasn't that consistent long-term care.
Right.
And it raises the question, what if there had been better resources, more preventative measures in place?
Yeah.
Could this tragedy have been avoided?
It's a tough question, and one that city officials and policymakers had to grapple with.
Right.
It sparked renewed calls for increased funding for mental health services, affordable housing outreach programs to help people falling through the cracks.
And it's not just about resources, it's also about access and awareness.
Right.
Many individuals with mental illness face so much stigma and barriers when they try to seek help.
Right.
And even when services are available, they might not know how to navigate that system or feel comfortable even reaching out.
It also seems like this case sparked a conversation about law enforcement's role in responding to mental health crises.
Absolutely.
Is it really fair to expect police officers who are trained for law enforcement to also be equipped to handle someone experiencing a mental health emergency?
That's a debate that's been going on for years.
Right.
And this case definitely added fuel to the fire.
Okay.
The sources highlight how some people are advocating for a more nuanced approach.
Right.
Arguing that we need these specialized crisis response teams.
Yeah.
People trained in de-escalation and mental health intervention who are better suited to handle those situations.
Right.
They say police presence can sometimes escalate things, especially for someone who's already in a vulnerable state.
Right. But on the other hand, some people say, well, if it seems dangerous, then you need law enforcement there to keep everyone safe.
It's a tough balance.
Yeah. You want to ensure public safety, but you also want to make sure that mental illness isn't criminalized.
Right.
Or treated with force that makes the problem worse.
It's a delicate balance and one that requires, careful consideration of individual rights and community safety.
Right.
This case, with its tragic outcome, really underscores the need for a more comprehensive approach. One that involves not just law enforcement, but also mental health professionals, social workers, and community organizations, all working together to create a system that prioritizes both safety and compassion.
Another layer here that's really relevant to those of us, living in cities is the question of public safety on public transportation.
Yeah.
It seems this incident really amplified those anxieties that people have about crime and disorder.
Absolutely. It touched on a very real fear about feeling vulnerable in these shared public spaces.
Right.
The subway in particular can feel like a microcosm of all these societal tensions.
Right.
And this incident brought those anxieties to the surface.
And the sources mention a whole range of proposed solutions.
Right.
Some people want more police on subways. Others are pushing for, better lighting, more security cameras, even social programs to address the root causes of crime and homelessness.
Yeah, it's like a tug of war.
Right.
Between wanting to feel safe and secure and wanting to avoid measures that could further marginalize or criminalize people who are already struggling.
It's tough. How do you create a system that protects this without persecuting?
Right.
How do you balance that need for security with a need for compassion and understanding?
It's a hard question.
It's striking how this case, which unfolded in a single subway car, has such a wide-reaching impact.
It's true.
It really cracked open a Pandora's box of societal issues.
Yeah.
We have to confront some uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our systems.
It's a testament to how interconnected all these issues really are. This case wasn't just about a confrontation between two individuals. It was about the fault lines in our society. The ways we fail to support those in need, the biases that shape our perceptions, and those difficult questions that we often avoid asking until something like this happens.
So it's like a ripple effect, isn't it?
It is.
It's one event sends out waves that touch every corner of our society and prompts reflection, debate, and hopefully some real change.
Yeah, it really is. The Daniel Penny case, while deeply tragic, I think really served as a catalyst for these crucial conversations and a call to action.
Right.
It pushed us to examine our own biases, our preconceived notions about, homelessness and mental illness.
Yeah.
And grapple with those complex questions surrounding self-defense, law enforcement, and our collective responsibility to each other.
And reading through these sources, it's clear that this case left a mark. I mean, it prompted calls for reform in mental health systems, police training, the criminal justice system as a whole. Yeah. But beyond the policy debates, there's this profoundly human element to the story.
Right.
It makes you ask, what does it mean to really care for the most vulnerable people in our community?
What strikes me is how this case goes beyond, legal arguments or political posturing.
Right.
It touches on our shared humanity and makes us think about our individual responsibility.
Yeah.
Do we look away when we see someone struggling, or do we reach out, offer support, a listening ear, a helping hand?
And that question, I think that's really what this deep dive is about.
Yeah.
It's easy to get lost in the headlines, the legal jargon, the abstract arguments.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, this case asks us to consider how we show up in the world.
Right.
How do we treat those who are different from us, those who are struggling, those who need our compassion and our understanding?
And that's where the real work begins.
Right.
These conversations have to translate into action,
right.
Whether it's advocating for better mental health resources, supporting organizations that help the homeless, or just, being more mindful of our own biases in our daily interactions.
Right. The sources mentioned a number of initiatives that got some momentum after this case.
Yep.
Increased funding for mental health services, pilot programs for alternative crisis response teams, public awareness campaigns to try and reduce the stigma around mental illness.
Yeah.
It's encouraging to see these things taking shape, but it's clear that there's a lot of work to do.
Yeah, and the change we need isn't just systemic, it's personal.
Right.
Each of us has a role to play in creating a more compassionate and just society.
Yeah.
And it starts with recognizing that individuals like Jordan Nealy aren't just statistics or talking points.
Right.
They're human beings deserving of dignity and respect.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I keep coming back to this idea of interconnectedness. Mm-hmm. The Daniel Penny case might seem isolated at first glance.
Right.
But it really revealed how interconnected everything is.
Yeah.
Mental health, homelessness, race, our justice system, they're all intertwined.
Absolutely. And that interconnectedness reminds us that we're not isolated individuals. Our actions, our choices, our attitudes, they have an impact. They ripple outward and affect the lives of those around us. And, this case, while tragic, I think really has the potential to be a catalyst for positive change.
Right.
For a deeper understanding and a more compassionate approach to those who are struggling.
It's a powerful reminder that even in the midst of tragedy, there's always hope for growth, for progress.
Absolutely.
For a world that values the well-being of all its members. It's a reminder that each of us has the power to contribute to that change, to choose compassion over indifference, understanding over judgment.
I completely agree. The Daniel Penny case may be over.
Right.
But the conversation that started is far from finished. And that conversation is ultimately about who we are as a society, what we value, and what kind of world we want to build together.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. I know it's been heavy and challenging, but I think ultimately incredibly important.